In 2007, the government of Pakistan announced 2007 as Year of Pakistan Tourism. So, it was one wonderful site on Lonely Planet Guide. There is macroeconomic development. The president says there are X number of mobile phones available. The economy is working, it's progressive, it's all what one would want in a middle-income country. But within 12 months, and I'm talking, end of 2007, beginning of 2008, suddenly Pakistan becomes the most dangerous destination on the planet. There is this 180-degree shift. How does that happen? But I think that's not the important issue. The more important issue is that there is so much text in between these two black and white lines, between the wonderful destination and the most dangerous destination. There is a lot of text. What is happening? What has happened? I mean, whenever you declare, whenever the government in the United States, wherever the government anywhere in the world, or the government in Pakistan, makes these declarations, there is always so much more that is hidden behind those declarations. And my book, Military Inc., is really about that other side. It brings that alternative perspective. It questions some of these declarations. See, if government of Pakistan would stop playing at numbers for a minute and start thinking deeply about what is the state of poverty. The issue is not whether the poverty, people living below poverty line are 36% or more, whether there is a difference of 3% here or 3% there. The issue is that you have a large number of people who are never represented in the current discourse on Pakistani politics. The problem, in fact, with this whole issue of the war on terror is that it hides more than it discloses. And what it definitely hides is the state of the people. The state of the people who do not have access to a lot of facilities that we basically take for granted in the rest of the world or even within Pakistan. For example, for the past 50 days, people in Para-Chanar, that is up in the northern areas in Pakistan, do not have electricity. There are wheat shortages, there are sugar shortages, and this is not just a temporary crisis. This is reflective of how resources are distributed generally. And I'm talking here about the young man, the 20-year-old, who does not dream about going to university, who does not dream about, a reasonable school, college education, but who is then tempted to go and join the jihadis, to fight, to become a martyr. And this is not just an issue of ideology. It's also a peculiar dimension of how poverty has developed, or how the issue of poverty has not been addressed. I'm not going to get into the details of that discussion. Probably we'll deal with it in Q&A. But that extremism is the spin-off of that lack of consideration, or a spin-off of a lack of attention to this vital issue of how resources are to be more evenly distributed. Is one of the spin-off is the extremism that we get to hear about. Now, of course, one of the questions which you might have in your mind right now is, what has military economy got to do with it? Am I about to propose that military is the worst institution, or military men are the only good bad guys? No, that's not the case, and this is not the argument of my book at all. See, when I started to look at the issue of how resources are distributed and how institutions, what is the state of institutions in Pakistan, because the nature of institutional relationships, institutional development, institutional balance or imbalance is very critical to how resources are distributed. And you naturally figure out that yes, military has emerged as one of the most powerful institutions. I mean, you come to the United States, and what you constantly hear is, by the educated Pakistanis, by the Americans, even by educated Pakistanis at home, that why even talk about the military? Because it's the only institution left in the country. But one definitely needs to look at this institution to at least critically examine what it's capable of doing, what it has done to itself, and how does it impact the relationship between the state and the society. So military economy is not just about the military. Military economy that I'm looking at is part of a larger elite economy. See, once you start looking at military economy as we have traditionally looked at it, which is what comes under the defense budget. Yes, Pakistani defense budget is a single line figure. We do not know the details. The parliament, it's not discussed in the parliament. It's precisely like Turkey where, you cannot discuss the military budget. But is that all that we have? You start looking into figures, you start looking into the resources which military uses, and you find out that actually the resources which are being used are much more than what is even given in that single line figure. For example, military economy that I would like to talk about today, and which I've discussed in my book, is not 3.5 or 3.6% of the GDP, it's much more. It would be a conservative estimate, it would be over 7%. So what's happening? More than that, as I said, this is an extremely elitist economy, and it is reflective of how resources are distributed and how resources have been distributed and what is the politics of that resource distribution. Let me quickly define what military economy am I looking at. This is the military economy or military capital that I have looked at in my book is beyond the defense budget. It is something which you find in all major countries of the world, including the United States. It is a product of the expansion of the security sector on one hand, and also the lack of transparency of what all the security sector does. You have a lot of economic functions which benefit the military directly and indirectly, and it's not just the military, it's the military fraternity, what I call the military fraternity, which means serving military, retired military, and certain members of the civilian community who directly benefit from from the military capital. So the beneficiaries, and because of legal and extra-legal mechanisms, it does not fall in the purview of public sector accountability procedures. So, to give an example, Halliburton would not come under the purview of public sector accountability measures here in the United States. In China, Pakistan, Myanmar, Burma, Thailand, and other countries, there will be extra legal measures to keep this economy out of the purview of public sector accountability. Now, and this is what I had focused on, and the term I use for it is milbiz, which is a combination of military and business. It is not just the corporate activities of the military, but this is something which militaries do in terms of profit making, and therefore, the term business, but it's much broader than just corporate activities. Let me quickly give you the example of Pakistan. See, Pakistani military economy has 3 tiers. The first tier and the third tier are actually very intransparent. The first tier is where the organization is involved directly into corporate ventures. And this is a segment which I call small and medium enterprise operations, or the cooperative type of operations. So you have the military involved in, I mean, there are hundreds of projects that they do, ranging from bakeries to gas stations to, even beauty parlors in some cases. And this is the same in, for example, in China's case. There have been instances when military has imposed taxes on national highways completely illegally. The law stipulates that they cannot do it. Yet, because of their power and authority, they have done it. It's very difficult. These operations are run into hundreds. They're very difficult to quantify because they completely depend on state assets on the defense budget. And if there is the secrecy, if the military is intransparent, if the defense budget is intransparent, then you probably cannot evaluate, what is the value of these operations. But they're definitely claiming important state resources. Then there is a second level, which I call the subsidiaries. And these subsidiaries are 5 military foundations, all controlled by the military. Now, what the military claims in Pakistan is that these foundations, which is, the first is the Fauji Foundation. Fauji means soldier. Fauji Foundation, which is basically a tri-service organization. Then you have the Army Welfare Trust. Then you have the Shaheen Foundation, which is the Air Force's welfare operation. Then you have Bahriya Foundation, which is the Navy's. And then finally you have the Pakistan Ordnance Factories Foundation. Now, between these 5 foundations, they run over 100 huge projects. And to give an example, these 5 foundations are into heavy manufacturing. In fact, they control 1/3 of heavy manufacturing in Pakistan. They're into cement production, fertilizer production. They make cereals. They're into education. They have run universities, colleges, schools. They're into finance. There's a military-operated bank, as you have in Thailand and a couple of other places. They are into insurance. They're into medical care. They're into a lot of fields. And this is the most transparent segment of milbiz, because very few of these corporations are listed on the stock exchange, and therefore you have access to some data. Not all are listed. Not all 100 projects are listed on the stock exchange. Then you have a third level, which is the level of the individuals. And that is where the game becomes even more interesting. Because there you see new concepts being constantly developed. The organization, which is the armed forces, the armed forces, the institution of the armed forces, uses its authority and credibility to bring benefits to its individual officers and officials. And so you have a situation, for example, that a new class of military agriculturists develops. The military controls, for example, the military in Pakistan controls 11.58 million acres, which is 12% of total state land. Not the whole of Pakistan, but state land. State land is about 93 million acres. Now, out of that 11.58 million acres, 6.9 million acres is agricultural land, and about 6 million acres have been distributed since 1960s amongst individuals at not even throwaway prices. Those prices are absolutely comical. And there is no control over the further sale of these lands. It's not just the agricultural land. Military personnel, especially the officer cadre, has been given land in urban centers as well. And I grew up in a city of Lahore, and this was the Lahore cantonment. In fact, my parents had bought the land for building a house there from a military general. So, as civilians, we could go and buy a house in a military cantonment. In years, and I grew up seeing infantry exercise grounds around me, shooting ranges and all of that, which military uses for its, army uses for its training. 10, 15 years down the line, it's gone. They're all housing schemes. They're all, big real estate ventures. And the beneficiaries are the officer cadre of the armed forces. That's just one of the many benefits that individuals have. Then military officers, especially the top-ranking guys, use their contacts in the organizations. And the organization's political power is essential in building their strength as entrepreneurs. I'm sure some of them would be, really wonderful entrepreneurs, great ideas. But it's my hunch is it's not just that. It's not just that they are brilliant businessmen, but they depend on the power of their institution to get them, to generate that influence and to generate enough, enough influence which helps them build their amazing businesses. Then you have military in civilian positions as well, in public sector departments and private sector departments. There is an essential role which retired officers play for their organizations. They are the main contact point. They become conduit in this larger military economy. So what really has happened since 1954? 1954 is when the first military foundation was started. Since 1954, what you have had is building up, a gradual building up, and gradual and systematic building up of military's clout as an organization. And not just that, building up of the clout of military as an independent class as well. And that is what then comes and links up with the rest of the elite structure of the economy. Pakistan's political system is Prætorian, it has been that. And one of the problems of Prætorianism is, the way it has been defined in literature, is that the lack of a neutral arbiter to negotiate conflict within the different political stakeholders. And therefore, the military or the bureaucracy is seen as an institution which can play the role of a neutral arbiter. The problem with the military turning into a class is that it no longer remains neutral to the process of adjudicating or arbitrating between different stakeholders, because it has definite interests as well. Let me give you an example. Pakistan has about 20 million landless peasants. We've had 2 failed attempts at land reforms, one by General Ayub Khan during the 1960s and another by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in the 1970s. Yet, 2 issues here. One issue is that, these gentlemen were never completely honest in carrying out the land reforms which would change the structure of socioeconomic redistribution in the society. But I think that is secondary. What is more important is that the land which was eventually which was surrendered by some and which to the state never really got redistributed. It is there with the state of Pakistan. The only system of redistribution of land, especially agricultural land, that you have in the country really is what the state gives to its military, to its military officials and officers, in particularly officers. There are differences within that distribution system as well. I mean, the military claims there is a system of merit, and agricultural land is distributed both to soldiers and the officers. But the fact is that, one, soldiers do not get as much land as the officer. The soldiers get about 12 to 12.5 acres. Good old days, generals used to get something like 263. These days, when probably there is deficiency and the pool of soldier is also increased, officers get 50 acres. But not just that. I mean, if you happen to be a senior officer, I wish we had multimedia today. I had brought some photographs with me. You have, to show you some of, these were pictures of the farmlands of senior generals. The land is guarded by paramilitary troops, which is paid by the taxpayers of Pakistan. They get huge subsidies. Farm to market road, water. This is something which the landless peasant or the small farmer does not get access to. And so, in reality, there is no difference between the new agriculturist, the general or the senior officer, and the local feudal who's already there, traditionally there. In fact, there is that bond developing between the two. For example, I'll give you an example. General Musharraf has 50 acres or more of land in Bahawalpur. I do not see his son, Bilal Musharraf, leaving Stanford or Boston, wherever he is in the United States, to go and till the soil there, to live in the land. He'll eventually probably sell it. Question is, who does he sell it to? Whoever can offer the better price. And that is what strengthens the local feudal landowner there. In fact, what has happened in the past 15, 20 years is that the whole issue of land reform has completely almost gone out of the discourse. When, even in the 1990s, every time there was a change of government, people who had land used to be worried, all right, is somebody talking about land reforms here? Maybe there is. Maybe there is a threat. Now there is absolutely no discussion. Because the elites have come together. The predation, military economy, as I argue in the book, is actually very central to that elite predation. Military economy is a form of crony capital. And one of its impact is that it encourages, it grows out of crony capitalism, and it strengthens crony capitalism. Throughout the 1990s and the 1980s and even 70s, well, actually not the 1970s, because 1970s is the only period in which this economy had slowed down. Probably Zulfikar Ali Bhutto understood that in order to weaken the military, he had to take away their financial autonomy. Yet, what he did in that, in weakening their economic hold, he made up for it by giving them political strength. But throughout the 1980s and 1990s, and even now, this military economy is dependent on other elite groups. And other elite groups also depend on it. For example, when I was looking at the reactions of what impact it would have, and I was going around interviewing big business and big industrialists in Pakistan on should the military be in business. I was surprised that there was very little reaction from them. Yeah, they don't bother us. There's another cadre down below which, complains about it. But why aren't the big industrialists complaining about it? Reason is that the capital that they're working with is as much of a crony capital as the military capital. And they both strengthen each other. You see, the issue with military capital is that it's not just the economic side which is important. It's the political side which is far more important. It brings financial autonomy to the military, having an independent. I mean, why did the military get into business? The Pakistani military did not have the same reasons as for example, the Indonesian military. The problem with Indonesian military and earlier on with Chinese military was that they were not all their operations were funded by the government. So if you had to make both ends meet, you had to undertake business operations yourself. Fair enough. Pakistan government provides for every need of the armed forces. We pay about 35 to 36 billion rupees every year as military pensions. So there shouldn't be any complaints there as well. But the issue here is that the urge for independence, the urge for financial autonomy, symbolically, politically, the military does not even want to depend on civilians for its welfare needs, for its personal needs. And therefore, one of the impacts is on the structure of politics itself. A powerful military, which becomes even more powerful because of its economic strength, because of its financial autonomy, is then not willing to give up that power. It talks about improving its image, but it does not mean business when it comes to giving up political power. And there, you can imagine, in terms of political development or future of Pakistan, there you can have, all sorts of wonderful combinations. The military does not have to be on the front seat. It could be on the back seat, because what it has developed since 1954 is this huge socio-economic redistributive system which caters to the elite, which makes sure that the elite fall in line. 1990s, 1980s, no government has ever tried to take apart the system, this peculiar military economy, which I call milbiz. And one of the reasons is because they are in this together. So once you start looking at what would Pakistan's future be, would it be a wonderful place to visit in the future, or would it become even more dangerous, as New York Times claims? Then I think the answer lies in looking at how relationships will be managed in the country. Will the elite, Pakistani elite, whom I think is extremely predatory, and let me quickly define, before I end, let me quickly define what I mean by predatory. It's not simple predation. Predation is a state in which the combined leadership of a country, be it political, be it military, are driven by short-term gains rather than long-term objectives. And a feature of predation is that the weak are replaced by the strong and the strong by the stronger. And so, therefore, there are no permanent ideologies or loyalties. And by the token of this definition, if they continue to remain predatory and stop even thinking for a minute about changing the redistributive process and system, then I'm sure we do not, nobody would have a wonderful perception of where the country stands today and where will it stand tomorrow. Thank you.
I'm sure that there are a lot of questions. Very quickly before we start the question and answer, let me make two brief announcements. I hope you all notice that there are books available at the table right over here. And also let me remind members of the Chicago Society to join us afterwards in the Culture Lounge just down the hallway. Questions?
What would a young Pakistani feel about all of this? I'm thinking of, say, a lower middle class, if that has any relevance, who maybe has some ambition and is probably not that aware of the grand view of this, but he's going, what part of this would frustrate him and perhaps alienate him or her in the situation? How would they react to this overarching military-industrial complex?
So let me tell you that this young man from the lower middle class is pretty aware of it, because the symbols of military economy are all over the place. You land at Lahore Airport. It's a fantastic airport. I mean, it's one of the examples of development in Pakistan. Beautiful airport. Spread out all around the airport are housing schemes. These are all military real estate projects. You go into town and you land in Karachi. Karachi is, you can call it the commercial capital of Pakistan. From the airport right into the heart of city, all you'll get to see is military installations on both sides. So to answer you, the lower middle class young man sees it. The problem which I'm trying to point out is that this redistributive system is so skewed that he feels totally helpless. When we look at, you're looking for responses? Look at the number of young boys that you hear about who become suicide bombers. One aspect of this suicide bombing is ideology. The other is the hopelessness.
But does that mean he cannot, for example, open a bicycle shop because the military somehow frustrates him, or he cannot borrow money, or he cannot get education because somehow the military frustrates him?
I'm not saying that military. What I'm saying is that it's not like Burma. Military would not go. You wouldn't have military people marching and taking control of things. In some cases, they would. For example, I remember people from Balochistan, Quetta, telling me the story. You had whole families, and they were middle class. They were not even low middle class. And they had, once upon a time, bought land somewhere near the provincial capital. And one day they decided to build, right? Some guys were retiring, they wanted to have a house. But as soon as they started building those walls, there were military officers who came and tore it down. Why are you doing it? This is our land. Well, because we want to build a cantonment, we want to purchase this land, but if you start constructing, the land will become expensive, we won't be able to afford it. So, get away. They go to the court. They get a judgment in their favor, right? judgment in which the judges decide on their ownership. But take the judgment. There is this guy standing there with a gun who doesn't even bother with the judgment, right? So that kind of a thing happens as well. But, you know, the military guy is not the only one doing it. You have the big landlords, you have, you know, civilians, you have other elite groups doing the same thing. And what I'm arguing here is that you then have a socio-economic and political system which is very top-down, which is authoritarian, which is very elitist. So this young man does not get all those opportunities. I mean, part of the problem in Pakistan today is that the education system has broken down because, again, it suffers from elitism. What you see, the young students that you see, most of them come from this private English medium education, which is elitist. The real problem, you know, I'm sure you've sitting in America, you've heard about the problem of madrasas in Pakistan. More than madrasas, what is problematic is the public sector education system, which does not provide this young man any social mobility. Where does he go? I'm sorry, he cannot think of borrowing money and opening a bicycle shop. Opening a bicycle shop is not very easy. They don't. They don't. Why would they? They, in a way, they strengthen each other. I mean, what is war and terrorism doing today in Pakistan? The war and terrorism is basically strengthening, you know, perhaps the American Pentagon, but definitely the Pakistani GHQ. Nobody else strengthens with it. And what you have in terms of these militants, these were all partners of the CIA and the ISI. They continue to have linkages, so they don't threaten each other at all.
You ended your speech saying Pakistani elite are driven by short-term gains rather than long-term objectives, and that therefore they have no ideologies or loyalties. So, what would you propose as a solution to this kind of system? Or if the solution is immediately available, what are the steps that can be taken to change it?
So personally, I don't have any answer. Reason is that if we could have answers, I mean, one is textbook answers, you know, do this, that, or the other. For me, answer is which can work there. And nothing seems to be working. What would shake up the elite in Pakistan to see that they should allow this trickle down to the masses so that it doesn't begin to stink. The system doesn't begin to stink. To that, I have no answer.
Sharp recently stepped down as the head of military. Is that a big deal? How much power did he really give up? And how does that impact Pakistan?
He's no longer the army chief. That's the only difference. He's still arm twisting. From a theoretical perspective, actually, he hasn't lost any power. At least not much power. Reason is because when he got elected president, or when he elected himself as president, it was while he was in uniform. So the position of the organization, of the military, was critical in his election. And, you know, he continues to live in the army house. It's unprecedented that, you know, an army chief has retired or resigned, and yet continues to live in the army chief's house. So it means that he has those linkages. Of course, he is less absolutely powerful than he used to be. I mean, earlier on he used to wear two hats, president and army chief. Now the power of the army chief has been taken away. But it does not mean, I mean, his power will diminish only when Musharraf as the president and the new army chief come in conflict. That is when it will really reduce. Sir, I would agree, but the other side of the argument is that Musharraf has opened up to India, or so he claims to do. Now the thing is that military is an organization like any other military organization in the world, which thrives on, which survives on a bogey, on a threat. You cannot have a military which does not operate. I mean, that's its mandate, isn't it? Anywhere in the world, here or there in Pakistan, anywhere in the world. So that threat has to continue. I don't have a problem if the Pakistani military says India is a primary threat. They continue to do that. I don't have an issue with that. My problem as a Pakistani begins, or my problem as a South Asian begins, when this organization becomes dominant in policy making. I think this is an issue to be decided by the politicians. And those who look at modern history of South Asia always forget that Pakistani politicians were always the ones on the front, who began to improve relations with India. The first agreement was signed between Benazir Bhutto and Rajiv Gandhi in early 1990s, not to strike on each other's nuclear facilities. Nawaz Sharif was signing the Lahore Declaration between India and Pakistan, which would have been the turning point in the history of this Indian subcontinent. Yes, the problem is if you give a military bureaucracy the role to rule the country, then it becomes very problematic and difficult to sort out relations with its neighbors. Answer is very simple. Firstly, India is as much a post-colonial state as Pakistan. It's just that their problems or the growth of their problems took a different trajectory. Indian civil bureaucracy is very strong, but in Pakistan's case, the political leadership completely lost control of the country and the political discourse the minute they agreed in 1947-48 to allow the war to happen. And then on, Pakistan turned into a security state. And the whole nationalist agenda was then built on this one key pillar, which was, an anti-India policy. Over-obsession with India. And that's where we got stuck in history. And that's where we completely lost control of the direction of our politics in the state.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned what could happen if General Kiani and Musharraf come into conflict with one another. Now, in that context, is there any significance of ex-servicemen, ex-generals lashing out against Musharraf these days? Is that a sign of, say, the military fraternity breaking up to some degree?
Well, those ex-servicemen have got nothing better to do. That's all I can say. I mean, they wrote a letter, and then, the next day, almost half of them were denying that, we never attended the meeting, we were never part of it. It's very interesting, when you come to Washington and see the number of ex-servicemen who land up here, trying to market Pakistan to the Americans, trying to get, fellowships, positions in the think tanks. But the problem is that military is a bureaucracy, and bureaucracy behaves like a bureaucracy, which basically means the new one who comes in to take control is extremely wary of the one, of his predecessor. So they're not likely to listen. So, you know, it's a good activity, but I don't think there is this breakup there. Not as yet.
Is any of the military agricultural land in the difficult tribal areas, or is it all safely centralized?
It is not centralized. It's definitely not in the tribal areas. It is in the areas. Pakistan's main agricultural areas are Punjab and Sindh. But you'd also find land in the frontier province. You know, land which can be tilled. So it's not in the tribal areas.
There was one right in the way in the back there, someone trying to come out.
I have one question and one point that I thought I need to bring up. First is the threat of India that we perceive, and my comment on that is that threat has always been created artificially by the Pakistan military, be it the 65 war or the Kargil war. The Pakistan army has always started things off. So that's the first thing, and the other thing is that these host of problems that you bring up, and I completely agree with most of the leaders' problems that are there. So do you suggest that the only way out of it is a mass uprising, or is there any other solution that we can look at?
That's one way of looking at, you know, India-Pakistan tension. While I'm one of those who get very critical when, you know, generals in Pakistan jump up and down about the India threat, I must also add that India itself has also contributed to increasing that, you know, that perception. We can be all in the Indian subcontinent be very short-sighted, and that is what has happened. Mass uprising becomes a solution only when nobody is listening. And this is what has been happening for so long. I mean, I'll tell you, when October 99 happened, 12th October 99, when Musharraf took over. Now, before 99, most of us were of the opinion that, no. Now, Pakistani military can just not think about taking over, right? The days are gone. October 99, military comes in again. And I had personally hoped that now the politicians will come together. They will decide on a norm amongst themselves and tell the military that, you know, next time, don't you dare come in. We'll refine our politics, we'll choose our own neutral arbiters, and, you know, you get off our back. Nothing of the sort happened. And I think, let me touch upon briefly upon one of the problems. And that is that Pakistani elite is so dependent on external capital inflows that the tendency is to look outside, not inside. So even if Benazir Bhutto has to find solutions, she doesn't, you know, look to the people inside, she goes to Washington, which eventually can't even save her. And even after she has died, situation is pretty much same. So I don't know what's it going to be. Pakistani people are educated. Pakistani elite is trained, educated in one of the best universities in the world. And yet, if they cannot make sense of this issue, that, you know, do not tempt people, do not anger people, then, you know, I'm sorry, nobody can tell them anything.
You mentioned briefly about the October 19th, what happened since Musharraf came. I have this question in my mind since then. That doesn't happen always, that political leaders have created a situation which allows the army to come to power, whether it is corruption, whether it is instability, whether it is restlessness in the society created by a person who is elected, but then he changes into a dictator and causes a situation which allows the army to intervene. Like October 19th, how far is it true that his plane was in the air for 2.5 hours? There was no fuel in the plane, and there were innocent people in there, and he was not allowed to land and was asked to go out somewhere in India or land somewhere else, which prompted the army to take over the airports and have an army rule. So how far is that true?
This happened on 12th October, not 19th October. That's true. See, but the thing is that what happened on 12th October, I'm not sympathetic with at all with what Nawaz Sharif did, right? If I was not allowing the plane to land, I'm not sympathetic with that at all. But having said that, see, the whole incident itself is reflective of the imbalanced relationship between institutions. See, after Kargil, the very strong, I wouldn't even call it a rumor, but, the almost confirmed story that was going around in Islamabad was that one will get the other. You talk to the diplomatic circle, you talk to anybody in Islamabad and tell you that, yes, either Musharraf is going to get Nawaz Sharif or Nawaz Sharif will get Musharraf. And so it was a game of cat and mouse being played. Constitutionally, as the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif had the authority to sack Musharraf. The question was, he did the stupid thing of holding the plane in the air for too long and diverting it to all sorts of places because of the fear of the repercussion. And what he feared actually happened, ultimately happened. There are two things which I'm trying to say, sir, in my book as well. One is that when you look at civil-military relations in Pakistan, the divide is not necessarily linear. It's not necessarily civil versus military, not simply that. It is the elite of Pakistan versus the people of Pakistan. So there's times when the political leadership and the military leadership is together, and there are times when they're apart. Yes, there is also this critical kind of battle which goes on for who is ultimately going to control the state. But going back to your question, I would still debate that the military as an institution had absolutely no right to come and take over the state the manner in which it did on 12th October 1999. They have always been part of the discourse, right? The first time the word Troika came into Pakistani political language was in the 1990s. The Troika meaning the president, the prime minister, and the army chief. They had to work together. But every time, despite that Troika, they would sack civilian governments. In many ways, instability has been has been encouraged. Instability is what keeps the institution strong. It's political control. I mean, being part of this Troika, you could always tell your prime ministers, do this or do that, or I'm not happy with that. Why do you have to come and destabilize a government? Because it's not just political destability, it is destability of the country.
This might sound like a normative statement or question, but considering that a lot of how elitism deals with things or considers social redistribution, corruption seems to I'm wondering what your views are on seeing ethical realities such as transparency, accountability, as still being possible realities in this situation, and corruption, considering the corruption that is very prevalent.
The question is, who will do it? My issue is that once military economy grows like the way it has expanded, and military becomes instrumental in benefiting but also protecting elite interests because it's part of it, then, who's going to bell the cat? We hear about the corruption of, we hear about Benazir Bhutto's corruption, we hear about Nawaz Sharif's corruption. But, all our lovely generals are almost equally corrupt. Who's going to hold the other responsible? They're all in it together. So I don't see that happening. And I do not see even external forces trying to correct that balance. The amount of aid which comes in, during this war on terror, there have been $15 billion which have been given to the military. There are USAID projects, there are ADB funding, lots of money pouring in. The consensus now is that all of it is being wasted. Half of it actually returns to whoever the funding nation is in terms of in the form of consultancy fees, but whatever does remain there is either pocketed by the local consultants or or there is corruption, and there's actually very minuscule trickle down. The question is, nobody's willing to stop the other.
Your talk was mainly about the political economy, the military economy. And I think the military economy, if you talk of the individual in the military and you talk of a brigadier or a one-star officer in the military, when he retires, his pension is about 65,000 rupees. And he is at a position when he has marriageable children of marriageable age, and they have house rent. The pension itself is not enough to sustain them. Not denying the fact that there is corruption in the military right now, and anything that you say about the military, negative about the military would be applauded, because of General Musharraf, he's done no good to the image of the military right now. But how do you suppose that the military can be sustained, the retired military officers?
Madam, you're right. People retire. In fact, the bulk of the military retires when they're majors, right? Firstly, let me point out that this military economy, one of the features of this military economy that I discuss and the way in which I discuss it in my book is that it benefits the military elite. The game begins with brigadier onwards. Once you become a 2-star and a 3-star, life becomes even more wonderful. General Musharraf, for example, has now got 8 properties, which includes the agricultural land, which includes, expensive urban properties. And I'm sure he's got one daughter whom he's married off. He's got another son married off, living somewhere in the US. General Shaukat Sultan, who is Director General of ISPR, once came to the editor of Newsline. She'd published an article by me and somebody else. And he was making the same argument. He was like, I've got 3 daughters, marriageable age, blah, blah, blah. So the editor laughed, looked at him and said, look, my father had 9 daughters he had to marry off. So by that standard, if marriageable, daughters of marriageable age is the standard, then my father needed more land than you. There are civil bureaucrats, there are police officers. I mean, leave aside all other civil bureaucracy. We have police officers, policemen who probably lay down their lives much more frequently every day than you'd hear, about soldiers dying. They get the same pension. They, in fact, get much lesser pension. Let me tell you, for example, that a constable of the police who is supposed to protect you and me or whoever is there gets 3,000 rupees. 3,000 rupees is not even $100, right? And he's supposed to feed his children, he's supposed to clothe his children, he's supposed to send them to school, and all of that. A brigadier comes in that segment of the military organization when he can have a reasonable living. Theoretically, I do not have a problem with providing for military's welfare. All countries of the world do it. I'm not against the concept. What I'm against is allowing welfare to be used for economic predation. That oughtn't happen. What is happening in Pakistan, for example, are indirect subsidies. You see, there is state land. Why can't the state of Pakistan, if it has to sell the land itself? The market value will be the same. You get the money, you probably fix, amount, give it to the generals, give it to the soldiers, give it to the officials, but then you can also have the money to spend on your development projects. Why give this one institution the authority to manipulate state assets? And I'm sure, talk to an economist and they will tell you that indirect subsidies are always more expensive than direct subsidies. If there are problems indeed with the system of welfare in Pakistan, then it should be done in a more holistic fashion. I mean, whenever we talk about the military, the absolute need to provide welfare for them, why do we have to forget the hundreds and thousands of other people who are working for the civil bureaucracy, the 20 million landless people? There is shortage of 5 million houses in Pakistan, right? And all you have now is all the real estate projects that are being made, and military capital is playing an instrumental role in it, caters to the upper middle class. What's wrong with the common citizen of Pakistan? Why can't we also provide for him? So to answer you, the upshot is make a welfare system, but let it be holistic. Let it deal with other communities, other segments of the society as well.
Okay, I'm going to promise you.
Two questions. The second one's more of a comment that I'm going to try to weave into a question before I stop talking. The first one is whether the framework of speaking of just about Pakistani capitalism in Pakistan is adequate to grappling with the issues that you're raising, whether it wouldn't make more sense to talk about sort of the broader framework of capital and the role that Pakistan plays in it. That is, that perhaps it is that the world system allows for Pakistan to remain in the role of a client state, as it were. One. Two, I quite like the historical narrative that you're telling. The first part I find sort of more convincing than the second, and in part that is about the role of the military, the shifting role of the military through the different historical, let's say, decades of Pakistan's development. That is, that it didn't inherit a strong military through the colonial state, but one that developed in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And so the question is, what changed in the 70s? And I'm wondering whether one would have to talk about the political shift, the decline of the left in Pakistan in particular, that allowed the military to step up as an abstract capitalist in that void of a left, or the co-optation by the Bhuttos and others of a populist agenda in the 70s.
Right. In fact, before the talk started, I was discussing this issue with Atiya, who's sitting next to you. I didn't.
He stole my question.
And Musharraf also owns a house in Oakwood.
All right. Kill him when you go home. Well, firstly, let me say that I may not necessarily agree that the military was weak in 1947-48. Two different things here. Infrastructure-wise, it developed during the 1950s. That's very true. 1950s, it got a lot of American aid. It had infrastructure, newer aircraft, men going to the United States for training, etc., etc. 1950s, it started to build institutions itself. 1950s, one other thing happened. And that one thing was indigenization of the officer cadre. 1950s, majority of the British officers were sent back. And there was rapid promotions of junior officers who came in to fill the shoes of the senior officers who had left. Now, this happened in India as well. But, India, the advantage was that, the political leadership had a different vision of how they're going to manage relations, etc., etc. But one of the impact on both militaries was that their strategic thinking has always remained substandard. I mean, I call Indian and Pakistani militaries as World War II militaries. They're not modern militaries. So infrastructure-wise, there was a development, but 1950s, there was this fundamental change in the military institution, which is that they became indigenized, right? That was the one opportunity these officers who were ambitious. I mean, General Ayub Khan, who was the first one to take over mount the first coup in 1958, General Ayub Khan was actually, if you read at his confidential reports, he was a below-average officer. He had served in Burma, I believe, during World War II, and he was given a bad report by his officer, and yet he managed to make it to become the army chief of Pakistan. So there was a lot of things which were happening then. 1947-48, what was essential was that they didn't have the infrastructure, but they definitely had the mindset. See, 47-48, the military leadership and the political leadership were partners in turning Pakistan into a security state. After the first war with India, 47-48, 75% of Pakistan's central government expenditure was defense dedicated. There was absolutely nothing which was actually spent on development. There was then a consistent and a deliberate weakening of socio-economic development, or development of the social sector, because 75% budget is spent on that. So, firstly, I do not necessarily link the 70s as the watershed. I see the development of the militaries way back 47, 48. 70s, yes. Very quickly, 70s, yes. Bhutto with nothing to offer. Bhutto, I think 70s was when Bhutto killed the progressive left. Progressive left died as well because of the, of the China factor. Because China and Pakistan were such good friends, and we are communist and the left was influenced more by China than by the Soviet Union. Therefore, there was this kind of, this soft corner for the Pakistani establishment. And then, Bhutto completely wiped it out.
I think we're very fortunate to have such a knowledgeable speaker and such a very passionate audience. So what I think we can do is have some snacks and be a little bit less formal now, buy some books, and please also thank our speakers.